utilize the raised hand function or pop it into the chat. We have some wonderful SCIPP staff, Erica and Evan, who will be monitoring the chat, but please be patient as we try to get to everyone. If your connection is stable, your device is willing, and you're comfortable, I invite you to turn on your camera, especially if you're sharing questions or comments. We will have an open Q&A portion a little later on. But before we get started with the meat of today and the content, I want to open with a land acknowledgement. So I'm zooming in today from Norman, Oklahoma, where the University of Oklahoma is located. The land that the university now resides on is the traditional home of the Hassani Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. This territory also serves as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma because of genocide, forced migration, and settler colonialism. Acknowledgement is only the first step towards justice for Indigenous people, and I recognize that it's not the same as reparations, and that many Indigenous people and tribal nations are continually struggling for the right to self-determination. This is a conversation about real actions that need to happen, and conversation that we hope to advance as an integral part of climate justice. So again, to introduce this series, it's part of a series of conversations on climate justice that the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program, in partnership with the Louisiana Disaster Justice Network, is taking on. Thank you all for registering, and we look forward to having follow-up webinars. The date and time of our second one is still to be determined, but it will probably happen in about 1 month's time. Since you are all registered, though, you will get an email with notifications that will have the information for this event, so please stay tuned. So I am also going to go ahead and share a few slides. So the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program is a NOAA-funded regional integrated sciences and assessment team whose mission is to assist organizations with making decisions that build resilience to extreme weather events and climate risks. We primarily work in the states of Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The Disaster Justice Network is a volunteer network that includes community leaders, faith leaders, advocates, activists, practitioners, researchers, and students, weaving together environmental justice and disaster expertise to develop strategies that address inequitable access to disaster response and recovery efforts, and to advocate for a justice-driven recovery process. The motivation for this panel came from a collective need from organizational partners to have deep conversations about the intersection of climate justice, disaster recovery, and resilience. As many folks know, there is a flurry of energy in the opportunities that new lines of federal funding might bring for communities who are in the most need of it. Much of this energy is coming from the intersection of this increased funding with a coupled commitment to environmental justice that's also coming from the Biden-Harris administration. So there are many different definitions and terminologies for environmental justice or frontline climate justice communities. But what I want to do is emphasize that a consistent trend relating to climate injustice, that those who contribute least to climate change are the ones who are left most exposed to climate hazards and effects and have the fewest resources to adapt. These are caused by structural conditions that have extracted resources from communities of color, Indigenous people, people living in poverty, and have also stripped persons of equal access to rights. Therefore, we contend that climate justice entails recognition of persistent forms of social stratification, particularly racial stratification, ensuring broader capabilities of marginalized groups, and preventing new harm and trauma. Our approach recognizes that justice communities are resilient and have the right for self-determination and thriving. We also recognize that communities have capacities and have been leveraging these to adapt. And we recognize that folks in the public sector, research organizations, the nonprofit community have the responsibility to work with in ways that don't perpetuate harm. So in light of this, we brought together two panelists who work to increase equitable resilience and who have been creating resources along with folks in their organizations to guide investment in infrastructure. And the Biden-Harris's Justice 40 initiative was also really an impetus for this webinar. So one of our wonderful panelists, Artie Griffin, is going to talk more about this, but just to introduce this Justice 40 initiative, this is something that was launched with the goal to deliver 40% of benefits of federal climate change related investment to justice communities. And then, of course, there is also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is putting billions of dollars into communities for programs in clean energy, clean transportation, green buildings, workforce development, grid and transmission updates, recycling, clean water. There's also federal programs that are related to climate resilience, like FEMA's BRIC program, flood mitigation program, that both fall within the within the Justice 40 pilot program and are getting a boost from the IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. According to the new Green New Deal Network, the IIJA will be the Biden administration's first test at directing these investments to justice communities. And without deeper engagement from communities, these funds could be invested in programs that continue to do harm. And so this is why this topic is really of vital importance. Some of our SCIPP folks are going to go ahead and put two resources in the chat that I think are very useful. The first is, it's really a resource of resources related to the Justice 40 initiative that was compiled by QAPA Consulting. And then a second is a resource of resources for the IIJA, and that is from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And I am going to go ahead and come back from my PowerPoint. So I am going to transition now and introduce our wonderful panelists. Unfortunately, we had a panelist who could not be here today. That is Arthur Johnson from the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development in New Orleans. This organization focuses on coastal rehabilitation, greening the built environment, and increasing food security by lifting up and strategically reinforcing community-driven goals. So we're going to also put a link to that organization's website in the chat so everyone can check out the work that they're doing, and hopefully we can have Arthur on at a later date to join us. So first we have Artie Griffin, who is a policy analyst and legislative director for the Emerald Cities Collaborative. Artie is an attorney with a background in state government and leads the ECC's Justice 40 work. In the chat, we are going to put a link to the ECC's Justice 40 Community Playbook, and she will talk more about this. We also have Dr. Allison Bridges, who is a lecturer in the Columbia Climate School's Sustainability Management Program, and recently co-wrote a guide with Sierra Scott for the Southern Economic Advancement Project on using funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for equitable investment in climate mitigation and adaptation. She recently completed a postdoctoral appointment with the Earth Institute and a fellowship with the New York City's Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, where she focused on partnerships for resilience. And we'll also put a link in the chat to that report. And now, without further ado, you'll hear from Artie, who can further introduce herself and discuss ECC's work.
Thank you. Yes, so again, yes, Artie, my name is Artie Griffin. I am the Policy Analyst and Legislative Director for Emerald Cities Collaborative. I'm excited to be here with y'all and talk about climate justice. I'm very excited to share a couple of our resources that we have been working on, developing, publishing, editing, updating. I feel like everything that we do is in this space is a living, breathing thing and is constantly evolving, especially as we learn more about the Justice 40 initiative. So yeah, just love to share some of our resources. If you could click to the next slide. Thank you. So before I jump into some of our resources, just wanted to provide some brief background on Emerald Cities Collaborative for those of you who aren't as familiar with our organization. So Emerald Cities, we are a national nonprofit coalition. We were founded in 2009 with the mission of greening our cities, building our communities, and strengthening our democracy. So a lot of our work really works at the intersection of environmental, economic, and racial justice. We are a Black-led organization, and we do have staff around the country. We are serving 10+ cities specifically with our place-based programming, but we're also supporting frontline communities across the country as well. Next slide, please. So as we have been thinking about the Justice 40 initiative at ECC, I think it's very relevant to highlight the fact that this really is, it's a federal initiative. It's not a law, it's not a statute. It's really this administration's attempt at trying to embed equity throughout the way that their agencies are implementing their programs and processes and ensuring that their program benefits are actually reaching the communities that need it the most. So as we have been really waiting on final guidance from the administration to better understand how the agencies are going to be implementing Justice 40 at each of their levels, one thing that we have been really trying to do is figure out how can we support communities and really build their capacity to meet this Justice 40 moment and really start moving it in within this entire environmental justice movement as a whole. So that's what we did with the Justice 40 Plus Community Benefits Playbook. This is really an organizational tool that we are hopeful that will, again, just deepen community understanding of not just their community concerns, but federal policy, both federal policy and federal spending, and to help them better understand how these benefits under Justice 40 could be showing up within their community. So the playbook is really 9 specific chapters. The first 3 chapters are really focusing on, again, deepening community understanding of federal policy, specifically the Justice 40 initiative, and really highlighting some of the various federal spending bills that have been passed within the last few years that could specifically meet some of their needs, and really emphasizing EJA because, as it was just stated, this is the first bill that the administration has been very explicit will fall within the Justice 40 initiative, and its programs should be aiming to target at least 40% of their benefits to disadvantaged communities. So we prime communities by explaining those, unpacking those various issues and explaining that. And then we take a deeper dive into 5 specific areas of potential community need. So really trying to understand or deepen community knowledge in the energy space, water, economic, inclusion, environmental and climate justice, and then also transportation. And within each of those playbooks, really trying to, again, deepen community knowledge to build their capacity, but then also start to connect some of their community concerns to various funding opportunities that are housed within Aegis, so that communities can start thinking about what programs should I be aware of? How should I, how is that program funding going to be entering my community? Who do I need to be talking to actually ensure that my community sees those benefits? And along the lines of who should I be talking to, kind of identifying various key stakeholders communities should be working in collaboration with to achieve their funding. So I think one of the examples that I always use about myself specifically is, my community has a lot of lead pipes. So what we try to do within our water justice playbook is help communities better understand why they have lead pipe issues, who they should be engaging with to have those lead pipe issues remedied, and what kind of federal funding opportunities are out there to fund that infrastructure replacement. So we do that within each of the specific sectors, and then we finish the playbook talking about community benefit plans. And what these plans are they are community-led, community-driven plans to help communities better advocate for those funding sources. So really, they identify what are the community's issues, clearly articulating the community needs, and then finishing with community naming their own benefits, because I think it's really important that we really acknowledge the fact that communities are experts within their lived experiences, and oftentimes we are uplifting the voices of policymakers, think tanks, academics, but really sometimes the voices of those who actually are experiencing the policy and living the policy don't go heard. And so one of the things that we were trying to do with ECC is finding ways, again, to elevate community voice and give them the tools and support that they need to advocate for their own community benefits. So that is the People's Justice 40 Plus Community Benefits Playbook. Thank you for dropping the link in the chat. Y'all can kind of go peruse it. If you guys have any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, I can always drop my email in the chat and we can chat more about it. So if you want to go to the next slide, I can talk to you guys about the Emergent Community Capacity Building Program. So as I think we'll talk about in this conversation, I think a lot of what I'll be saying is that it's really important that we're resourcing communities to build their capacity to advocate for themselves. So one of the ways that we at ECC are trying to resource and build capacity of communities is by creating this Emergent Community Capacity Building Program. This is a 12-month-long program where we pick a cohort of 10 community-based organizations. We provide grant funding between $25,000 and $50,000, and that can be used for whatever their program needs. The only stipulation is that they can't use it for lobbying, given our status as a 501c3. And then along the way, we provide monthly workshops that are really centered around community needs. So we provide kind of a list of programs that or workshops that we can provide, but also want to survey the actual cohort members to get a sense of what do they need to see, what do they need help with? Is it comm strategy? Is it financials? What, just really getting a better understanding of what supports that they need to continue their community efforts and trying to find ways to help support that. And then of course, then also we provide one-on-one mentoring sessions to really foster that one-to-one connection and really help providing deep community connection and just, building community capacity from that perspective as well. Next slide, please. And, I think one thing that happens oftentimes with grant funding is that there's a lot of red tape to get to the grant funding, and then there's even more barriers when it comes to reporting. So we tried to make this a very low bar to admission for communities. The application was 5 questions, and the only really reporting requiring of our communities is that they tell their story. It can be in whatever narrative. It could be a video, it could be a mural, it could be, a story map, whatever it is. We allow them that flexibility to tell their story in their own way. And then we also ask that they complete an energy democracy scorecard. Our ED scorecard is a really good way to help communities better understand where their community is as it relates to the spectrum of being in a very extractive economy versus a very regenerative economy. And then we ask them to create a community benefit plan, which we go really in depth into in our community, our community playbook, where you can see actually a step-by-step process of how we actually go about creating those. And then, of course, our expected outcomes, just creating, building community capacity around energy democracy, and really helping them build out strategies to really leverage the Justice 40 funding or Justice 40 initiative in order to see an increased level of benefits within their community. So those are our programs, and thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to go ahead and ask a question because this came in earlier in the registration questions. But Artie, can you talk a little bit about how you define community, because that's a term that we're all using, but sometimes we're not really defining. I think sometimes we're thinking of community as a whole municipality. Other times it's a community-based organization or maybe a neighborhood. Can you talk about how you define it and who the playbook is meant for in those terms?
Yeah, so the way that we really define community is community residents. And we really want to target, frontline communities that are literally, their community is sitting right next to an incinerator, so that they are actually experiencing the increased asthma rates of the air particulate or air pollution. And other communities who are dealing with solid waste incinerators, just communities who are actually experiencing the very real environmental harms of, heat island effect, everything that we're talking about, the flooding, the combined sewer systems, like all of these issues that are really being exacerbated by climate change. So those are really the communities that we're targeting, because those are the ones that are the most underserved and the most underrepresented as it relates to environmental justice harms. So it's to us, it's the same communities that Justice 40 is trying to target, the communities that have been have felt the vast majority of the environmental harms, but have received the least amount of funding. So when we talk about community, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about frontline, we're talking about BIPOC, we're talking about EJ, CJ communities. That's who we're talking about. But I think that's a great question, because when you talk about community, there's more than just its community members. There's businesses, there's anchor institutions like universities or healthcare systems. It's much bigger than just the actual residents. And so one of the things that we're really encouraging community members to do is that when they build their community coalitions around their community benefit plans, that they're looking to engage those partners too, engaging their electeds, engaging their state agency leaders, federal agency leaders, really expanding what it means in the broader sense of community when they are working toward obtaining their community benefits. So long-winded way of saying we mean EJ communities in the way that we work in ECC, but also we should be thinking broader about what community means, because it's really going to take all of those stakeholders to ensure that these communities are seeing the very real benefits that they need the most.
Great, thank you for that. So let's see, Allison, do you want to go ahead and further introduce yourself before we go more into a discussion Q&A? And if you want to talk about the SCIPP report as well.
Sure, I can do that. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Sorry, I'm traveling now, so that hopefully the internet connection is going to be okay. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Again, I'm Allison Bridges. I'm a lecturer in the Sustainability Management Program at Columbia's New Climate School, and also a lecturer in environmental policy at Emory. And I did this work for SCIPP. SCIPP is the Southern Economic Advancement Project. It was founded by Stacey Abrams in 2019. And it basically works to amplify the work of other organizations and networks. It works at the intersection of social and environmental policy, social and economic policy. I was doing environmental work. I was brought on just to basically look at the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. It's a large amount of funding and how it could be used to advance environmental goals, resiliency goals, and equity goals. So that was the report I wrote for them, and I worked on that with Sierra Scott, who's a graduate student at Georgia Tech. And the link is there in the chat. I didn't prepare any slides because this is, the just the whole report is there, and hopefully all of you can check it out. It's basically meant to be a resource for local level governments. My background is in urban planning and policy, so I was really looking at how municipal governments can use some of the funding. Sometimes it does have to flow through the state level government to the local governments. So I'll leave it at that. It's great to be here, and I'm so excited to hear the work of Artie, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of the Justice 40 issues around equity and the work I did with SCIPP.
Great, thanks so much. So I want to start the discussion by, thinking about the fact that when it comes to spending on federal government spending on many things, disaster recovery being one of them, mitigation, infrastructure, right? Researchers have known for a long time that the most at-risk and underserved communities aren't prioritized within those policy structures. Research has also shown that sometimes, for example, public assistance after disasters, that this money and infrastructure can actually widen racial disparities in wealth. So when it comes to this context, it's not hard to imagine that ensuring justice could be challenging, but yet there's so many opportunities. And so if you could talk, Artie and Allison, a little bit about what's needed to really realize those opportunities and what are the biggest challenges.
Sure, I can go first. I think one of the biggest challenges that we are working through routinely at ECC is how do we build better procedural equity for frontline communities. One thing that, with the Justice 40 initiative, I think we're all waiting on bated breath for the final guidance and to understand the covered programs that agencies are starting to announce, and specifically what are those benefits. However, I think it's very unfortunate that it appears that this is working from a very top-down approach of ensuring, we're waiting on the agencies to tell us what their benefits are, instead of asking communities what are the community named benefits that they need. And so when we talk about procedural equity, it's about how can we ensure that community has a seat at the table to ensure that they are providing that community expertise and they are able to dictate what benefits they need to show up in their communities that will actually meet their needs. So oftentimes we've seen situations where, a project developer will come in and they say, oh, we put a nice big shopping mall in your community. That's going to be a community benefit, but a community benefit to who? And so, where could those resources actually been invested in to actually ensure that the overall community is being lifted up in that space? So that's one of the things that we are really working on, is how can we make sure that at ECC, we're using the privilege that we have as we move in spaces with federal agencies and state governments. How can we be amplifying the voices of community and making sure that their concerns, their needs are being lifted up to those entities, but also trying to make sure that we create opportunities for frontline communities to speak for themselves. I was very, very fortunate to be able to connect some frontline communities in Indiana with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation around some of their NEVI programs, the NEVI program and how that's being deployed in Indiana. So it was so great for me to be able to just take a step back and let communities actually advocate for what is happening on the ground and what they need to see for that plan to actually be beneficial for them. And it was very heartening to hear Joint Office officials saying, as states are supposed to be developing their Justice 40 metrics, we are telling them, talk to your communities, build your metrics about what they need and whether or not you're actually meeting their needs. So it's heartening to hear those conversations, but I think that's what we need more of. We need more of communities having seats at the table, which is why we which is why we created the playbook to really expand upon this idea of creating community benefits agreements, having communities come together, name their own benefits, and amplify their voices and create advocacy tools for them to go to their leaders and say, this is what we need to show up in our community. So really providing procedural equity in terms of giving them a seat at the table to have those conversations with state and local leaders, but also with the Justice 40 initiative. A lot of the initiative was talking about building in stakeholder engagement and community engagement along the way. So ensuring that agencies are talking to communities when they are defining their program benefits, but also I think we could do a better job of community engagement. So often I run into issues or go into meetings with state officials and they're like, we just don't know how to do this. And it's like, just ask us to show up and resources to show up. So, it's not public engagement if you host a community engagement meeting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on this day. Nobody's going to show up because they're all working their jobs. So making sure that you're creating opportunities that are both accessible for community members at spaces that are accessible to them. So go into their communities, meet with them where they are, or if you're going to ask them to come to you, resource them to do that. So it's just really important that when we talk about community engagement, we're not just taking that for granted. We're actually resourcing the community and creating opportunities that are accessible ways for them to actually provide for meaningful, fruitful engagement. I used to work in state government, and it's always amazing to me how they put these committees together and then they give them a budget to provide them with the number of people that they need to actually provide them the expertise to have an informed opinion on how they're supposed to be voting. So why aren't we doing the same thing for communities? Why aren't we giving them the resources to actually have to allow them to show up in a meaningful way and to actually engage in a meaningful manner?
That's great. I completely agree with everything Artie said. That's definitely the first step, is getting the engagement piece functional and working, and that information flowing in a way that it can be used by the people who need to use it to do the planning. If we're talking about the SCIPP report, and I was looking at how infrastructure investment is made, there's a very long implementation process for a lot of infrastructure. So you need to engage communities early, and you need new tools to understand how to use that information, because there are a lot of government people, they have the right intentions, but they don't have the right tools. They need new approaches to cost benefit analysis. They need to know how to integrate that information. They need equity scoring. If you look at how, you're working on Justice 40, and Justice 40 has, I think it's 21, correct me if I'm wrong, pilot programs that they're starting with. So there's a lot of other programs funded under the bipartisan infrastructure law that aren't part of Justice 40. And so all of those need to eventually have some kind of method of looking at equity in the implementation process. And we see what's going on in New York. I was working in New York before I was working in Georgia, and New York has a big climate act, and they have I think it's the Climate Justice Working Group, and they've been working really hard to determine, once you get into the nitty gritty, okay, well, how do we define disadvantaged groups? Who are they? What's the area median income? What's the cutoff for that? What kind of climate risk are we going to include if we're talking about climate change? What are the racial and ethnic and income criteria that we're looking at? Are we looking at health criteria? So who are the disadvantaged groups? Are they frontline communities who are exposed to other environmental hazards? And then beyond that, as Artie was speaking to, what are the benefits? Like, what benefits are we talking about? Are they social? Are they economic? How are we going to quantify that? So as Artie was mentioning, that's what all the government agencies are working on now. How are we going to quantify that? So the community engagement piece is one part of it, and that has to happen early, and it has to happen in a meaningful way. But then you still have to use that information and make it actionable in the long term during the implementation process. So I think that's the other big challenge that you see in a lot of states and local governments.
Yes, and I want to follow up because, and there's also 2 comments in the chat that I want to get to, but I want to follow up with this idea because you both mentioned metrics and tools that are needed to translate, kind of the community voices and ideas into action items for policymakers. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about maybe where research is needed into creating some of these tools, because on the one hand, we need the alternative approaches to cost benefit analysis and equity criteria. On the other hand, there's also an inundation of tools and metrics and, maybe particularly mapping tools that all of the agencies are coming out with. So I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about that in terms of where's the greatest need and how can we make sure that it's not overly complex and confusing and people can use it in the way that it needs to be used.
I definitely think that there's a lot to be, I guess. I definitely think there's a need for research, especially when that research can help bolster community voice. One of the coalitions that we work with, the Black Appalachian Coalition, they put out one of their Black papers where it was a very beautiful combination of community members telling their stories of their experiences, but then also combined that storytelling piece with data to essentially, I hate to say validate their experiences, because their experiences are absolutely real and they are experts within their lived experiences. But I think it was beneficial for that to be juxtapositioned against kind of the data to show, yes, one of their biggest issues was Black erasure in Appalachia. So showing that, there's a huge demographic of BIPOC people living in Appalachia, just to kind of help validate or just support, I should say, support their storytelling. And so I would love to see more collaboration amongst researchers and local community members to help them amplify their voices and tell their stories, because you always hear a lot about policymakers relying on graphs and data and fact sheets and one-pagers, and it would be really nice if community members could have those tools in their toolkit, so that way when they are advocating for their community needs, they can their storytelling can be bolstered by the research provided by academic institutions. Sorry, I hope that answered your question. At least that's that's how I heard it. So I hope it answered your question.
Yeah, in terms of tools, it's a tough question because it's so specific to what people do. And you're really, because I work at the urban level, and when you get into urban level work and it's all very on the ground kind of work, everybody has really specific tasks, whether it's the utilities or energy, is transportation, it's people providing human services, and they all need different information and they all have tools that they're already using. So it gets tricky developing all those new approaches. Part of it's coming from the research community, some of it's coming from within agencies just trying to learn better approaches to whether it's accounting for carbon or embodied carbon in projects, or the equity piece. A lot of it comes down, a lot of agencies really depend on cost benefit analysis to look at which projects they're going to choose. And so there has to be new approaches to cost benefit analysis that include equity criteria and that include environmental criteria. And it's really tricky. And there's a lot of work going on. There's certainly, there's a lot of research in this area, but it's not standardized yet. And it's still really kind of hotly debated issue what the right approach is and what will be the right approach going forward.
And then also, one thing that Allison said really also reminded me, like when we talk about, using data to amplify community voice, it can go the other way too, because with the climate and economic justice screening tool, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard from communities that the data in the tool is not indicative of their lived experiences. So I think making sure that we have community voice to kind of inform data as well, to make sure that it is reflective of the lived experiences of community members, because the tool is only so good as its data. So it's important that we have robust data to make sure that we are actually targeting the right communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I would reiterate that with some of we heard the same thing with the work I was doing actually in New York City with an initiative called the Climate Knowledge Exchange, where we really engaged communities and tried to engage communities and agencies as much as we could to try to kind of see how people were using data and what data they needed. And we heard that repeatedly, that the lived experience from communities, that it was really about their lived experience and what the information they needed to make choices about how they buy their homes and if their homes are going to have long-term value, if it's a coastal property. They really having that information, that two-way flow of information is really important piece of that.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead. There's a few questions and comments in the chat, and I invite the folks who wrote those if you want to pose them or expand upon the question. But I have one here that asks for Artie in particular, are you finding any collaboration amongst the agencies to work together to work with communities? And I'm assuming that means maybe the federal agencies?
Yeah. So I will say that as relates to Justice 40, I think as with all things, some agencies are better than others. I know that Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, EPA, all of those agencies, I think have been really taking this Justice 40 mission to heart and really trying to ensure that it's implemented, doing their best to make sure it's implemented at the state and local level. So I will say those three agencies, in terms of identifying ways to build capacity within communities, it sounds as though they are trying to work together to really combine their technical assistance funding that they get for programs and finding ways that they can use that funding to build the capacity of communities. And what it seems like that's looking like is them offering these regional technical assistance hubs for communities where they're either providing direct assistance to communities or resourcing intermediaries to provide that direct TA. So it does seem like there is some collaboration with some agencies to work together in this space. However, I'll be honest and say that I have not seen that across all agency-wide.
Did that answer the question? Is it Adelheid?
Yes, thank you, Simone. That did.
And then there's a question comment from Sean. Sean, do you want to go ahead and pose that?
Sure. And this is really, really great. Thank you to both of you speakers. I want to just talk to you alone for an hour. I don't want to take your time necessarily. I work with NOAA. I in the national office for visas that funds SCIPP. So we are actually working presently on Justice 40 within NOAA. And so we've seen the process from the inside, and it has been both exciting and very frustrating. Certain paths that they have decided to take, I don't want to throw them all under a bus, but because there is an attempt to do this the right way, but there's also, it's really hard to make the federal government do something right. And it usually ends up boiling down to a data project and just making sure that you're checking off the box first. So we've been trying to implement this with RISA we had an opportunity a year and a half ago to actually build this into the proposal. So we've been trying to do it in a way that encourages really what's more of a cultural shift towards more of the procedural things you're talking about and actually engaging with communities beforehand. But that's not really aligned to, that's not really what the Justice 40 initiative is specifically asking us at the agency level. What they're asking is really for us to articulate what the benefits are, which for a question in some cases, but it's hard for a research program. In many cases, we're trying to collect as much of that sort of data as we can. But anyway, the comment was that, in the near term, while we do this for the infrastructure funds, first of all, there's an incredible level of attention towards these things. So it needs sort of approval at every single governmental level inside agencies, of which there are a lot. And they are essentially, because it becomes, the impulse is we want to make sure you're doing this. We want you to check off the box and make sure you're checking off the box. The impulse becomes, where are you articulating the benefits before you send out the funding? And it's interesting from what I heard you say, it's really that you need to build a process so that you're actually catching community articulation of what the benefits should be, which we have an opportunity to do by doing it with competitive grants. I'd say that we could still build in things that make it more clear. And that leads to my question. My question is essentially would you have any examples or suggestions of what you've seen in actual competitive grant processes that are out there when there's a competition? Have you seen community consultation sort of built into that process? Of which I can think of, a few examples that we've seen, but I would absolutely love to take in more, because even the timescale that the notice of the funding goes out to when it's due is often such a constraint, let alone the fact that the person applying for funds, if this is researchers, they have to actually be interested and engaged in letting the community have a voice. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions for us.
I think the first thing that pops into my mind is the NOFO or FOA. I always get mixed up which agency calls it what. The Reconnecting Communities grant through DOT. One thing that I was really excited to see about that opportunity was not only was it based on trying to reconnect communities that have been, divided by different types of, highways, rail tracks, what have you. But one thing about that program guidance that I really appreciated was the fact that they were prioritizing applications that where applicants were essentially building a coalition that involved community to plan out the processes, how they're going to go about the reconnecting communities aspect of that grant program. So I think really prioritizing applicants prioritizing applicants who are either committed to engaging community within their planning process or building stakeholder coalitions with community, I think is a really good aspect to ensure that they are incentivized to engage community within their process, but not just, make that commitment of engaging community, but clearly articulate a plan for how they're going to go about that process, whether they're going to engage a local CBO that is trusted within the community and can provide accurate representation, or engaging other intermediaries who are efficient in engaging frontline communities, making sure that you're not only prioritizing applicants that make those commitments, but providing accountability measures on the back end to make sure that they actually have to follow through with that commitment.
Yeah, I was trying to think of good examples as well, and none come to mind that I really think are great. There are definitely some out there like state level environmental programs for rehabilitation of different things I've seen where there's a requirement to have community engagement on the front end, and they actually have to be on the application. In the initial stages, but I can't say that's really meaningful engagement, and there's certainly not. I haven't seen, or at least I haven't seen the monitoring and evaluation piece of that, as Artie was mentioning. That is an important aspect. You can't just say, oh, this is our partner, we're going to throw their name on there, and then not follow up and make sure that they actually did have a say in the development of that. So that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Thank you so much.
So I'm gonna also pose this question in the chat, and this comes from Hannah. And Hannah, if you would like to pose the question, you can as well. Just let me know.
Sure. Yeah, this is kind of building off the question that Sean just asked, and the community engagement aspect is, because I've done a little bit of kind of digging around on the screening tool and the different metrics that go into it, and yeah, the comment before about how those metrics don't reflect the lived experience, I think is really apparent in looking at kind of community level indicators that are flagged in the tool. And I'm curious how much bearing those metrics have, after a community is selected, is kind of being flagged as disadvantaged and would at some point down the line be a recipient of J40 funding. Yeah, how much bearing does those metrics that they get flagged for at the initial screening tool have in terms of prioritizing certain programs or certain, pots of money that those communities would then potentially receive?
I think that's a great question, and the answer is really to be seen. I think that's why I know that I'm clicking refresh on the White House's environmental justice website to see when they're going to post that final implementation guidance, because that is my concern, is that if we have a tool that is not necessarily reflective of the community's lived experience, that is then going to dictate which communities are prioritized in receiving certain program benefits, that's concerning. I know that there are other agencies, they're not just relying on CGIS, they've got other tools. I think Department of Transportation has a Justice 40 equity tool. EPA's got their EPA screen. There are other tools that they can use to kind of fact check, or I guess double check, to make sure that they're really hitting the hardest hit communities. But yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we're all waiting for that answer, is how much weight is going to be placed on CGIS when it comes to actually determining which communities are being prioritized for the funding. And whether or not, and I guess just are they going to be prioritized? Is it just going to be, the minimum 40%? So are they literally just checking a box and saying, okay, well, we look at our numbers, X amount of benefits went to, some disadvantaged communities. So are even the hardest hit communities going to be targeted for that funding? So I think that's a really great question. And I wish I had a better answer, and I'm excited to see the response at the administration level.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is all kind of, I'll just add to that quickly. It is all kind of evolving. I know in New York State, they came up with 45 different indicators, for defining what disadvantaged communities could be made a priority. So if you have compounding difficulties or systemic historical legacies, or you're also on, the border of fence line community of some environmental contamination, and you're at 80% of the area median income, then you have higher priority than if you only fulfill one of those criteria. So that's the way they're kind of evolving it, that even those criteria are currently in the public comment period. So, but those criteria were developed in consultation with representatives of the community leaders in the EJ community. So we'll see how far, what they actually end up determining to be the key criteria and determining how programs are implemented. And I know from the federal level, especially under the bipartisan infrastructure law, they do prioritize programs that give more federal money. So there's the federal money and there's a state match, and they give more federal money if it's for disadvantaged communities. So the state match would only be 10% of the program cost, whereas the normal state match might be 20%. So they're trying to incentivize those programs to be prioritized by giving more federal funding in those instances. So that's another way that they're trying to encourage that work.
And I'll just say, Hannah, asking about a central database of these various tools. If you go to that Justice 40 resources, that's one place to start. It definitely is not a database of all of the tools, because many agencies are coming out with their own versions, but there's at least links to the CJUST tool, and then also to EJ Screen, or there may be a few others. I think there may also be links to different organizations that you can sign up to receive notifications about updates to the Justice 40 initiative, and perhaps Artie or Allison know of other ways to be able to keep tracking this. But it does seem like there's a ton of developments that are happening in real time, and so maybe that's literally just refreshing the WeJack page.
Yeah, I dropped in the chat a link to EPA's. They actually keep track of, they have a central landing page for the environmental tools that they use, but then they also link to a lot of the state EJ screening tools if they have them, which I have found as a helpful resource. So I dropped that link in the chat too.
Thanks. And thank you, Sean. That also looks like a great tool for looking at different vulnerability indices and metrics. So before we open it up to other Q&A, I do want to talk a little bit more about the capacity challenges. Artie, you talked a little bit about this in terms of how your organization is, trying to help communities overcome some of those barriers. Allison, I'm sure there's different sets of capacity challenges for local government. And we've, also heard about some of the ways local government can remove some of those accessibility barriers. It certainly seems like very low-hanging fruit to not hold meetings in the middle of the day. Honestly, that seems like it should be a no-brainer. But I wanted you both to talk a little bit more about what conversations about capacity are we not having that need to be had, and maybe what are the responsibilities of folks in different sectors, maybe the philanthropic community, the private sector, academia. If you all have any thoughts on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always at ECC are always saying resource the community, give them funding, help them build out their projects. There's a lot of awesome community-based organizations that are doing great work to advocate for their communities. So fund their work, help them expand their scope. I think oftentimes, with the different philanthropic organizations, especially in this moment, I feel like there's a lot of funders looking to provide funding to enhance equity environmental work. And I think that's great. But perhaps instead of funding the gut reaction is to fund the intermediaries or the national organizations that have big names in this space. And so from our perspective, when we're in those meetings, we're asking them to fund the ecosystem. Don't just fund the intermediaries, fund the communities. Like, they know what they're talking about, they know what they need, give them the resources. I cannot stress enough how important it is to fund people to show up. Like, it's so crazy to me that you have just a wide variety, like just array of community organizers who are working their 9-to-5s and then going home and then busting their butt to make sure that their communities are getting the resources that they need. Like, fund them, give them that opportunity. And so, yeah, sorry, I feel like I sound like a broken record. Like, communities know what they need, give them community name benefits and resource the community. They know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's an important first step. And then, beyond that, there's also just that technical assistance too, because communities do know what they need and they are willing. There's always a lot of willing people to engage and do the work, but sometimes, they don't have all the resources they need to do that work. So it needs to also be the political will needs to be there to support those communities and the work that they want to do and are prioritizing. And that happens at a lot of different levels. There's some things you hear, just to give an example, at the municipal level, different cities that use different forms of participatory planning or participatory budgeting. And then the planning process is a pretty long planning process. And you hear a lot, communities need to be involved in the early stages of this process. And that's great, that's right, and that's true. But somebody at the higher levels also has to change that process so that communities can be involved by law, by the legal structure of how the city's administrated. So it takes also those connections across governance levels. It takes a political will to engage communities and to engage them in the right way, in the meaningful way, and to really incorporate what they are prioritizing into the governance process. And that doesn't always happen. And then there's also one thing I liked about SCIPP, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, is that they also are trying to build networks, and they're trying to build those connections between the research community. If you're a community, maybe you know that you live next to a post-industrial site, but you don't know what's there. And you need somebody to go and research what contaminants are there, because you also have received the information that you're in a flood zone. So maybe there's going to be a flood that's going to carry contaminants over to your neighborhood, but you need a lot of scientific information to understand what is there and how dangerous it is, and then what's the flood zone, and which houses is it going to impact, or who's it going to impact. So those connections to the research community, I think, are also important. So that comes into the whole funding question. We're talking about the competitive grants. I think developing those research questions too with communities on the front end, so that you are getting the information that you need. All of this has to do with having this action-oriented research and action-oriented policies and evidence-based policies. There needs to be those better linkages, or communication networks, communication and information architecture between the scientific community when you're talking about climate and environmental issues, the communities, and then the government, who has to have the political will to do the right thing.
Yes, this is really important points. Caitlin has a comment. Do you want to expand on that, Caitlin? If not, we have some other.
I don't really need to. I was just thinking that just following what was just said, not just, these people knowing, what their risks are, but are there any options for what they can do about it? And we seem to fall short of that all the time.
Yes, that's such an important point. There needs to be the actionable solutions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Are there other questions from folks in the audience? Feel free to drop them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself.
I see somebody ask about what are the options for the community to do anything about this flooding and pollution situation I mentioned as an example. Yeah, I mean, there are things you can do. Environmental remediation is expensive. Brownfield remediation is expensive, but there are tons of brownfield remediation funding sources. Sometimes they're city level, sometimes they're state level, sometimes they're super fund projects that would be the federal level. And there's other, baskets of money as well. So if you can identify a super fund site, there was an example in Atlanta recently where they uncovered a lot of slag, which was very high lead content in soils and community gardens in East Atlanta. And they actually were able to designate that as a Superfund site and get the money for that remediation. And that was a research project out of Emory, led by Ari Saikawa. So the research can lead to real action. And then you have that federal money and they'll lead the Superfund cleanup process. So if you can identify the contaminants through the research process, you can take action to clean it up, or to, sometimes there's some pollutants you just have to cap or vent in different ways. And then there's also relocation. I mean, if it's a really dangerous area, you can't live there, unfortunately. I did a lot of work in Brazil before I was working in the United States. And in Brazil, a lot of people live on very steep slopes, the favelas and the low-income groups. And sometimes you can't make those communities safe because it was an unstable environment to begin with. I mean, there's frequent landslides. So having money for those relocation processes, and we may see this more in the United States as we have more coastal inundation, sea level rise. So managing the process of relocation from dangerous areas is also needs funding. That's another way to deal with that issue.
And I just like to add to that as well. So, a lot of the coastal flooding is something that folks in my organization and a lot of my research has focused around. And also folks in the Louisiana Disaster Justice Network, particularly the Lowlander Center, who have done very extensive community work with the bayou communities that are most vulnerable to sea level rise, to storm surge. And these are Native American communities, they're Black communities, historical communities, Latino, Hispanic, etc. And they have definitely been historically disenfranchised. And there is a real justice issue in trying to have these folks relocate on their own terms and have the ability to make decisions for themselves as a community. And so I would just say there was a wonderful workshop that the Lowlander Center hosted. There's a National Academies report that's coming out about community-led relocation, or hopefully the model will move to a very community-led way. And so that might be a resource coming out soon to take a look at, because there's definitely a lot of justice challenges for relocation, particularly when folks the property that they live on, the property values are declining. It's very hard to get a good rate enough to be able to even move to a safer area. There's been racial discrimination in buyout programs, and then there's the whole issue of how do you keep a community social cohesion and social functioning in that context too. So they're really fraught challenges, but there's a lot of research, and hopefully there's a lot of really good conversations happening about that. So I just wanted to mention that as well. I wanted to, if there's no other questions, I wanted to get to two that folks posed in the registration. And one of the question is, which approaches work best for communities or community organizations in terms of engagement with researchers to aid in climate adaptation and planning and implementation? And I'm curious if anyone, if Artie or Allison, if you have any experience seeing community and research partnerships that have been particularly successful.
Alice, I was going to give you the opportunity to go first, since I feel like I've been taking a first stab at all these questions. So if you would like to speak first, please feel for it. Go for it.
No, it's fine. I love to hear what you have to say first. Yeah, I think, you have these kind of established partnerships, like, things like the Sea Grant programs that have a long track record of this community engagement around research. And I think there's some new models coming up too. I mean, more than my work with SCIPP, which is more just a report. I work in New York, where I was working with between the New York City panel on climate change and communities. And we were trying to think of ways to better forge those collaborations and to find the funding to help facilitate getting the funding for that research as well. And so, it's just a matter, I think, also of making those kind of platforms, or, it can't always be internet based though, because a lot of people don't have access to the internet, but just making ways for communities to share what their research needs are. And then for researchers to be able to connect with those people and find those opportunities, and then to have the kind of collaborative development of the research program and the grant process. I think it has a lot to do with that communication infrastructure, like I was talking about. So new ways of connecting communities with the research community in ways that put the community needs at the forefront of the research.
Yeah, no, I would definitely echo that, Allison. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think the only other thing that I would add is just be willing to meet communities where they are, because oftentimes you're gonna have to work around their schedule in order for them to actually have the capacity to engage in the research opportunity. So just being mindful that you might have to do it on the weekend, or you might have to do it after hours, just to create that space for them to be able to participate.
There was another question that somebody posed about specific barriers, capacity barriers for community in terms of, we've talked about resources and grant writing processes, but are there other barriers that maybe don't get thought of as automatically, maybe access to networks, or other types of resources, not just sort of the monetary ones?
I honestly, I feel like that's one of the big ones. I think when we engage in communities, a lot of the times that they're seeking assistance on is, we don't know how to write a grant. We don't know how to manage a grant. So what resources are there for us to not only have the capacity to get the fund, or not just have the funding, but like actually, where are these supports there to help us write the grant, to put together a budget, to put together the financials, to actually apply for the funding? I think that's what we hear a lot of from communities. There's a resource out there, the Justice 40 Accelerator, and that's a lot of the technical assistance that they provide, is connecting CBOs with grant writers, or the financial resources that are the financial how do I want to say that? The financial, one of the things that we are providing through ECCB is connecting them with the RCFO to make sure that he is, providing them mentorship on how to properly run your grant. How do you mind the financials? How do you adhere to the reporting requirements? I think that's a lot of what they need, because I think that's the key barrier to grants. I mean, first off, finding them, because grants.gov, whoa, like that is a mess in and of itself. Like when you talk about user accessibility and user friendly. So just not just finding the grant, but then actually giving them the tools and the resources they need to actually get the grant. And then being cognizant of the fact that the rigorous reporting requirements that they're going to require on the back end are going to be even more difficult. So providing assistance on how they actually manage those requirements when they get the funding. So a lot of it is, how do we access the grants? Where are the grants? And how do we comply with the reporting requirements, so that way we don't get this, the funding isn't clawed back at the end of the grant term because we didn't spend it appropriately.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add on that. I think that's exactly right. We hear that as well with the work I was doing in New York with the community groups. just the technical assistance about the grant writing, and like you said, where to find the funding. So where do we go, and what are the funding? What is the funding that's available for climate resilience work? Because a lot of infrastructure is very expensive. So I mean, engaging communities in large scale projects is also challenging, having to balance all of those. And it takes staff capacity too. It takes somebody, we heard from Sean earlier, working for NOAA, somebody has to do that in community engagement, and it's time consuming. And like you said, you have to do multiple rounds to make sure everybody's had an opportunity to join in and share their work, their opinions, sorry.
Sean, do you have something to add? Question or
Yeah, on that same note, it just kind of flows into even something I was considering saying to Adelheid earlier about whether the agencies are kind of working together on it. And unfortunately, like, a lot of this is a little bit chaotic, I think, in its first year or two of iteration. And as already said, we're kind of waiting for the guidance, the finalized guidance from the White House. And it's kind of been in a constant state of interim guidance for so long, which creates a lot of uncertainty. And I mean, in practical terms, the actual CGIST tool didn't even come out until a few months ago, and it was after like agencies had already been required to submit things. So one thing I wanted to just like characterize into how this is probably going to be for the first year or two is that it's actually going to be, it's essentially just a modification of the existing programs that are already out there. Like in some cases, agencies have new funding and are launching new programs in order to fit this. But in most cases, it's like existing federal programs that are then adding approaches that can fit with Justice 40. So that means it's all the same problems of trying to find funding in a central place. There's all a bunch of mission specific mandates. And as much as we try to, even in our own program in RISA, we try to be as broad and community focused as possible. We're still, research and climate oriented. So we have to fit within those boxes. And, and also the approaches are different because each program is trying to figure it out within the interim guidance. So even the question of whether we're using the CGIST tool, it's not finalized yet, that the expectation would be there that would be the one and only tool we would use to identify disadvantaged communities. There are problems in identifying what communities we're talking about beyond, I mean, there's geography and data problems with the tool itself, but there's also non-geographic communities. And the original interim guidance, they were like, yeah, non-geographic communities, like communities of people that are alike in some way that categorically are underserved, that should be a category that fits for prioritization. But right now they have it set up going in a geographic direction. So all of these things are up in the air. And I think each program is trying to figure it out. So there's no like big organized official interagency collaboration in the development and of the implementation of this, because it's going to be, I mean, there's conversations with the White House essentially. So the White House is going to decide eventually based on everything that was provided. But in the meantime, I will say that there's like kind of covert staff level interactions that have started to develop amongst us of the people that have to pull this stuff together. That has actually been really interesting and fun because we've been talking with each other about how we do this meaningfully. And it's helped us, I think, to get beyond just the data call, because we do have to do certain things with the data call to make sure, like some agencies and programs are saying, we're going to use CGIST regardless of the fact that we know it's flawed, because we can't change it at the last minute when the White House requires it. So we're going to assume that they're going to require it, and we're going to make that the main thing. Others aren't doing that. So it's helped us to get beyond those things and actually talk about like, but where can we actually build a lot of substance in this? So it's a very slow process to get to a meaningful place, but I want to thank you both again for especially this like treasure trove of resources, because it can be really handy as I'm looking through it. It's really handy for pushing back a little bit in the normal development of this as we go, to make sure that we're still moving this in a direction of, it's probably not going to get there in it like the first year of change, but it's starting to trend the way things are developed. And lastly, I wanted to mention that in the way that they actually seem to be doing the infrastructure funds and tying them to Justice 40 benefits, it appears that they're not doing it for all of the infrastructure funds, that they may be just looking at the programs that they selected initially for Justice 40 and only looking at the crossover for the ones that are both Justice 40 and infrastructure, which is kind of disappointing in the long scheme of things, because that really limits the influence that these mandates would have. So for NOAA, it's like really lonely. It's just the NOAA RESA program and essentially a project with National Heat Integrated Information System that is phasing out in funding. So not even Sea Grant is tasked with this particular line of questioning. And then a lot of the other programs that are receiving infrastructure funding aren't necessarily yet required to answer these questions. So keep on pushing them as we will within the negotiation of the program development.
That's great. Thanks for sharing all of that. Sorry, Simone, I know you're about to say something, but I just want to follow up on that. It's, when you start this process and you start the dialogue and you get people talking and everybody agrees communities should be involved, but then you really get into the weeds of it, like Sean's talking about, and it's not easy, right? It's not easy to learn how to do all of this and develop the right techniques. And you're right, not all of the infrastructure funding is involved in the Justice 40 initiative. And so it seems like it's a pilot initiative. My understanding is these 21 programs. Let's see what works and what doesn't, and learn from the experience this next couple of years. But at least it's a start.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sean. And it makes me feel better knowing that there are staff who are really working hard to implement this. I know that you guys are very much limited in what you guys could do. I know that oftentimes you're confined by statutes, and again, this is an initiative. It's not like the federal government can't force states to comply with federal policy. So I get y'all are operating under certain constraints, but it does make me happier knowing that. Oops, sorry, my dog had a lot to say about that. Hold on. But thank you for that. I appreciate it.
I just wanted to say that in that resource in the Justice 40 resources, I think another interesting angle of this is states trying to adopt some type of state level legislation that would direct funding, and so that could even go beyond 40% of the benefits. Why not 60? Why not all of the benefits? Sort of thing. So that's another interesting wrinkle in all of this. And I guess I wanted to point out that there is a link in the chat, and that's for participants. If you would click on that for an evaluation of this webinar, it's really short. It's just a couple of questions, and so we can help us to improve and also have ideas for further topics. And Sean, I actually maybe want to follow up with something that you said about about pushing federal agencies, and what can we do as folks outside of the government to be advocates, and champion Justice 40 and equitable resilience.
I know that the most direct pathway has been, I don't really know how random people will consult with them, but the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee is essentially the front line of community feedback on Justice 40 specifically. They've been meeting pretty regularly. Actually, if I could check my calendar real quick, there's another one coming up really soon.
3rd and 4th.
Oh, next week. Yeah, 3rd and 4th. Maybe I can right after this I can drop a link if somebody can't find it earlier. But yeah, so that's like the immediate one, and that's like something anybody can tune into, so that helps you like get a sense of what's going on. And I don't remember whether they let random visitors, attendees ask questions. It might just be the panel, but yeah, so that's an opportunity. And then they're announcing each program that has done something with Justice 40 thus far. They're essentially like phasing out announcements of each one as they go. And I I guess it's the way that each agency will take, I don't know if it'll be in the announcement how you can like send feedback, but each agency is like releasing something. We're actually slated to go next week as well. So you're free to give NOAA comments in however the way that makes sense when that's released next week. And probably it will be on the NOAA website.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thanks, Artie, for dropping that link into the chat. So with that, I think we're winding down. I want to give one last call for folks in the audience for comments or questions. And also to remind everyone in the audience to please fill out that evaluation webinar, and a reminder that we'll follow up with an email that will have the recording, the slides, and the evaluation link, as well as these various resources that we've been discussing. And I'm also going to put my email in the chat if anyone has questions or follow up and would like to reach out to me directly. And that being said, Artie and Allison, do you have any closing comments or thoughts that we didn't get to yet?
Well, just want to say thank you for this opportunity to be present and speak with y'all. I will also drop my email in the chat just in case folks have outstanding questions or want to connect.
Awesome.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much for having me. I can also put my email in the chat. I learned a lot from everyone here, and it was so nice to meet everyone. And anyone, feel free to reach out anytime if you want to discuss more. If you work in a similar field, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much. Great panel.
Thanks all. All right, so we have some homework. We can all go and tune in to the meetings that are coming up, and you know, get our letters together for public comment. And great seeing everybody, and thanks for the participation, and thanks again to the panelists. And with that, good happy Thursday afternoon and happy weekend.
Bye everyone. Thanks.
Bye.